Hi, everyone. Chris Martinson here with your Off the Cuff podcast. And today we're going to be talking with a good friend of mine, Art Berman. He's a petroleum geologist, real expert. You've heard him before. For all of you who are new, maybe you haven't heard Art speak before, but he is going to talk with us about oil and the energy markets and lives down in Texas, as all oilmen should. And Art, welcome to the program today.
Well, thanks, Chris. Good to be here.
Well, today it's Friday, June 5th. Crazy day. The markets are just on fire, the stock markets, because apparently the U.S. economy added 2.5 million jobs last month, which I'm afraid I've lost connection, Art, completely with anything coming out of this administration as having anything to do with anything found based in reality. So I like to go back to reality as much as possible. Oil to me represents reality. If you're using it, your economy's doing well. If you're not using it, your economy's doing a little worse. That's how I see it. Is that a reasonable supposition to have?
Yeah, I think it is, Chris. I mean, I think we've always agreed on the fact that oil is the master resource, at least for now, for better or worse. And from my perspective, energy is the economy, and oil is the most important part of energy for now. And therefore, as goes oil, so goes the economy. And that's part of the reason that it interests me as much as it does. I'm a geologist. I love the earth, but oil is a great it's a great indicator of human behavior and economics, and therefore it is of interest beyond just the rocks and the stuff that comes out of the ground.
So let's go there. How is oil demand? U.S. and then globally. Where are we at in this story?
Better than 2 months ago, which is to say, we're still in hell, and we haven't yet reached purgatory. So things are better if using more oil is better, and perhaps not all of our listeners agree with that, but that's fine. So oil consumption has increased, as you might expect, because the economy is more open than it was in the middle of April. That said, it is going to be, I believe, a much longer and much more uneven path upward to wherever we're going, and no one knows, so I'm not going to really speculate, but I have some doubts as to whether, well, I have no doubt we're not going back to where we were a couple of months ago. I just don't see that. But
You mean ever?
um, probably not. No,
Why is that?
because human beings adapt remarkably quickly, and we've adapted to a new way of doing business in the world, which involves less mobility and perhaps higher efficiency. We've got a lot of people who are out of work, and getting them back to work won't be easy. Many of them perhaps will not go back to work, at least not in the jobs that they had before. So we've damaged the economy, or it has damaged us, or both. And those kinds of recoveries are they're just not it's not linear. You don't just the economy's not a switch that
Mm-hmm.
okay, we turned it off, that was clear, now we've turned it on, and it's not going to respond in the same way. So and the other thing, of course, is that well, there's no money. The oil business is in terrible shape, whether it's private companies or state-owned companies. There's no money for anything except the most basic level of maintenance. So it's going to be a very long road back to anything approaching the kind of production levels that we saw a year and a half ago, and probably because of the changes in lifestyle and the damage to the economy. I mean, we may never get back there. I hate to say never, but it's a possibility.
Yeah, my analysis has always been that we had these increasing interventions by the central banks, which were really there to support the credit markets, which was a way of saying we need people borrowing and more money. And they were reasonably successful at that. And so we had a student debt racket and bubble, and we got auto loan bubbles and all this stuff, right? I think that's broken at this point in time, right? Like it's just not possible to get back on that same trajectory. One, because there's 40 million people not working who are not credit worthy at this point in time. But I think behaviors got changed. This is our once in a every so often there's a generation that gets defined by something. And the coronavirus really defines this at this point. I think there's going to be a lot of people saving instead of borrowing, right? And so those are really big changes that are going to hard to get back from. But more than that, I don't know how bankers, including the Federal Reserve, convince people, hey, what you really want to do, Art, is borrow more money. Let's get you really far into debt, right? Going into debt is a bet that the future is going to turn out kind of like in a predictable way. So it takes time, I think, for people to become comfortable that this is in any way, shape, or form predictable again. And so that just on that basis, I think we're running into trouble. But to get into the oil part of this story, I know you were tracking this even more than I was tracking it close. The shale business didn't make any sense at $60 a barrel. It was still losing money. I know they kept telling me, Art, they were saying, oh no, we're breaking even at 30 or 40. Well, are they?
No.
No.
To be very blunt about it, no. But as with many things in the world, I mean, it's complicated, and so there are different basins and different companies and different parts of different basins. So, I can't. So we're talking about averages or norms or something like that. So, on average, no, nobody was making money at $60 a barrel.
Mm-hmm.
There were some companies that were making money at $60 a barrel. There were some companies that were losing money at $60 a barrel. So it's it's like saying, what's the average height of a human being? Oh, well, it's 5'10". Well, no, it's not.
Mm-hmm.
Some people are much larger. Some people are much smaller. But $60 was that was basically a market clearing price. I mean, that was the price that the market was willing to pay for a barrel of oil, kind of at the 5-year average. That's what $60 was. And so when companies said, oh yeah, we're making lots of money at $60, well, a few of them might have been making some money. Nobody was making more than a little money. And the question that you always have to ask when somebody says, oh, my break-even cost is X, is what does that number include and exclude? And most of the time, that number excludes a lot of fundamental costs of doing business, like salaries and corporate jets and office space and just sort of basic G&A, general and administrative costs, without which you got no company. I mean, your company isn't a bunch of oil wells out there. Your company is people. So you exclude things like that. You were talking about debt. Well, does your number include interest expense? Well, kind of makes a difference. On a personal level, most people's interest expense is pretty high these days. Same with companies. For a lot of these companies, it's a couple of dollars per barrel, just an interest expense. So, I can go down the list, but you get the idea. You hear a lot of people talk about, oh, wow, Saudi Arabia, their costs are, $4.80 a barrel. Well, no, they're not. I mean, that may be the cost of operating the equipment that brings the oil to the surface. But they're a big company. They got salaries, they've got corporate jets, they've got offices, they got all kinds of stuff. And so when I go through their financial data, which they released in 2019 when they wanted to do an IPO, I get a number that's closer to $40 a barrel, all costs included. Now that's cheap. I mean, that's a lot less than $60. So, the idea that Saudi Aramco is a lower cost producer than most remains true, but it's not $4.80. And there are people that'll dispute the 35 or 40, but that's the data that I have. That's the data they gave out.
Yeah. And let me talk about one other thing in that larger equation. You said a company is people. It's also your capital. And so this side of the story, when I see that their interest expense is a couple of dollars a barrel, I also, though, wonder about, well, it's not just the interest expense, there's the principal. And so a given company is sitting on a given range of leases, and that's a certain amount of acreage. And technology can fiddle with this a little bit, but there's only so much oil that's coming out of that acreage. And so to me, what I would want to see in these companies is, are they pulling oil out profitably? Given their overall acreage, what's the return going to be on the capital overall? Because it's not just paying the interest, you got to pay the principal back too. So there's some calculation in there that says there's only so much oil, and here's how much money we're throwing at it, and that defines the return. And Art, when I try and run those numbers, like you say, some companies, it sort of makes sense and I can balance that, but I find companies that are so upside down, I'm like, who gave these people any money at all? There's no way they're going to be able to pay that back.
I don't think there's any intention of ever paying it back, Chris. I mean, that seems to be the way of the world these days. I was giving a talk at a unnamed oil company's board meeting and annual general meeting. This was just the officers and the board members, and I sat next to the CFO, and this company has a lot of debt. And I said, "What are you planning on doing with all that debt?" He said, "Oh, it's no problem. We'll just roll it over." So for them, it's just it's a line item on the balance sheet. It's they, or this particular financial officer, he just didn't treat it as anything that had to. There was nothing to be done about it except to restructure it periodically so that it stays where it is. Paying it back is not an issue, or has not been. At least that was one anecdotal situation I was involved in, and I don't think it's unique.
Well, if I was on the other side of that and I owned that debt, I would want it to be paid back. So who's holding that bag?
Well, that's a real complicated question too, and so banks are only part of that story, and in fact, the actual bank lending to most of these oil companies has not been very great in recent years. That the banks kind of got replaced by the venture partners, and then the private equity, and then the secondary share offerings, and then there's all sorts of over-the-counter transactions that we can only speculate about. But there are many sources of capital. Let's just put it that way. And banks are not the major source these days.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of liquidity flooded around. Of course, that we see the stock market is well north of where it was a year ago. NASDAQ's at all-time new highs in the maw of Art. You never could have a year ago if you said, Chris, we're going to have the most punishing GDP print in U.S. history, more people out of work than at any point in time on an aggregate or a percentage basis, and the stock market's going to be powering to all-time new highs. I would have said, you're nuts. But I would have had that little hitch in my voice because I know that the Federal Reserve can print as much money as they want. And if you print enough, it's got to go somewhere. So some of that's got to be, available to that CFO to be able to roll over their debt. There's just liquidity everywhere. I think it creates moral hazard. I think you make bad decisions when there's so much money you don't know what to do with it. But looking at that, how many companies do you think are? I mean, you're in the heart of the business down there. I've just, from my end, I just read about how many rigs aren't operating, and I think about how many people work a rig, and it's just got to be chaos down there in terms of actual staffing and companies folding up shop. I mean, is that the case?
Well, yeah. I mean, to keep it real simple, but it's it's uneven. So it's the oil field service companies that are really getting hurt. Okay, it's It's the companies that provide the drilling rigs, that provide the frack fleets, that provide, you name it, the mud, the bulldozers. I mean, all that stuff. So, and just to clarify, there is this perception that everything has come to a stop, and that's not true. I mean, we have 200 and some odd horizontal rigs drilling shale wells, mostly of some sort or other, that are out there. So it's not zero. I mean, it's down by 50% or so from what it was several months ago. But I mean, so there is work being done. But some of the companies, the actual exploration and production companies, have not laid off staff. Most have. But yeah, in general, it's pretty damn bad, and it's really it's as bad as any time that I've seen it, and it's been bad many times in the past. This feels a lot more like the mid 1980s than it does, 5 years ago, or 2008, 2009. This is, I mean, this is worse for sure.
Well, and looking more internationally, I know that I was tracking the international service companies, like the rig companies, Rig, Trans, the big ones. They were hurting before this came along, and this just looks like a boot in the small of the back at a bad moment. International oil companies can't be doing I can't imagine they're making any first investment decisions here on anything in the deep water or out offshore, because to me, every time I look at that, it just doesn't make sense until you're twice today's oil price. So I assume that stuff is pretty well shut down. Is that true?
Well, to be honest with you, a lot of that deep water stuff hasn't made sense really since 2014.
Mm-hmm.
And it wasn't making any money when oil prices were $100 a barrel either, and that was because the service side of the equation was very, very high. But without complicating it, I mean, so we talk a lot, and some people like to bash the shale companies as being unprofitable, and okay, fine, they are, and I'm at least known as one of the chief critics, and I'm not really a critic of the geology or the oil or the people. I'm just a critic of the economics. But the hard and sad truth is that there really aren't very many plays in the world that are more commercial than the shale plays, which is the reason for their popularity. So, as I've said before, these are kind of the best of a bad lot. Now, you compare them with an oil field that was discovered in 1970, and they don't come close. But we're not finding those oil fields anymore. So if you're comparing likes to likes, and you're saying, well, what are the economics of the Permian Basin, average well out there, look like compared with the deep water well, since we're talking about it? And frankly, they look better. Maybe not full cycle, but again, in terms of return on capital employed, they cost less, and you get quicker results. So that's that. They're popular for a reason, and because we're, I hesitate to say we're running out of oil, because that gets us into all kinds of discussions that really aren't very productive. But it's clear that we ran out of cheap oil a long time ago.
Mm-hmm.
And so with that in mind, everything that's happened since the late 1990s is more expensive, and so we're comparing things that cost too much. That's what we're doing.
Yeah. Well, I've had a theory for a long time, which other people have had as well, which is that there's a floor. If oil goes below that floor, it won't get discovered, it won't get prosecuted, things won't get done, because you can't afford to do it. And I thought we've been kind of below that floor for a while, and I've been surprised at the ability of cheap money to sort of violate that floor. But people have been happy to go along with that for a while. And then there's a ceiling that the economy can't afford either, because it's so debt ridden, right? And we're going to come out of this crisis with more debt than you've ever seen. It'll just be over on the public side instead of the private side. But massive quantities of debt. So that floor ceiling thing is in play, and it feels like it's getting tighter, and there will come a time where I think those two touch, and we can't afford not to get oil, and we can't afford to get oil. And I don't feel like we're making any plans for that day. But that really feels like where we're at. So if we look at this floor, to me, and I can't get my hands around it because I'm just, Art, it's so much information is coming so quickly, and it's not great information, but I read about one company cutting their investment budget. I hear about the CapEx being slashed. I can't imagine that the international oil companies, watching them borrow money just to pay dividends right now, that they're doing a lot. Feels to me like we're going to have a really huge reduction in the capital spending this year again. And that just feels like that gives us a shortage of oil at some point in the future. Feels like I don't understand how you get oil without spending money.
Well, that is a fairly basic concept, but let me stop for a second and clarify what I think is an important insight, and that is the difference between the price of oil and the value of oil. And while we're at it, let's talk about the cost of oil. And so we talked about break even. Okay, that's the cost of oil. What does it actually cost to get it out of the ground? So let's say it was $60 before all this COVID-19 and economic shutdown. Okay, well, that wasn't the price of oil. The price of oil was less. Let's just say, for argument's sake, it was $50 when oil was 60. Okay, so what's the value of oil? Well, the value of oil is the work that we get out of it. And so if you don't want to get into the complications of it, but some smart people have figured out that there's something like 4.5 years worth of human manual labor in a barrel of oil. And if we take the median income of the United States, about $26,000, then a barrel of oil is worth something like $115,000 to $120,000 a barrel. So there's this huge disparity between the price, the cost, and particularly the value. Mm-hmm. So when we try to understand, well, like, why do people put money in oil? Maybe they don't understand this in the detail that I just explained, but it's because of the value. And so if you're the president of a country or an economist, and you understand that oil has this absolutely unmatched multiplier effect, that a barrel of oil does 4.5 years of human labor, you can't live without oil, because there's absolutely nothing that comes even close to that productivity. So if you don't have oil, and if you have oil and your economy is growing at a sluggish rate, then you take oil out of that equation and you're on the floor, man. I mean, so you gotta have oil, let's not even talk about to grow the economy, just to maintain some level, even the low level we're at. Take oil out of the equation. And I mean, we're all back to some form of semi-subsistence living. And without getting into the whole Green New Deal and everything, I mean, I don't think this is something that a lot of those sort of people, and by the way, I mean, I consider myself an environmentalist and a conservationist and all those kind of things too, but the idea of supporting an economy on wind and solar it's going to be a really poor economy. Let's just put it that way. You take that multiplier effect of oil out, and I don't think that the people that are pounding the table for let's go to 100% wind and solar have any idea how poor that's going to make the world. And you know me, but not everybody here does. Mm-hmm. I'm all for wind and solar. More of it, quicker, the better. I'm just saying that it's not a substitute for oil. let's fill in the oil and natural gas and coal use wherever we can. But you can't just replace it unless you're willing to turn the clock back 50 years or more and live in a much poorer world. So if you're running a country or you're a politician, you gotta have oil. So we talk about, what happens if all these companies go bankrupt, or a whole bunch of them do. Well, I mean, the government has to do something. I mean, the government may become the owner of those companies, as the government effectively became the owner of General Motors in 2009.
Mm-hmm.
That was too big to fail. It's not too big to fail, it's too vital to fail.
Too vital to fail. I agree. And thank you so much for bringing the price, the cost, the value. $100,000 a barrel, we'll just use the round number on there to make that even. That is what it's worth. And as we were talking before we started recording, I'm sitting on 180 acres right now, and I got about 12 of those are an open field. And I was just out on my 50 horsepower tractor yesterday because I had to bush hog some down so I could get the grass to revitalize so I could put my cows on there because I'm getting cows. And I cut about 2 acres of that field in about 35 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
And if you put me out there with a scythe, I'd still be out there. I'd be half ruined, and
maybe more than half.
3/4 ruined. But I was admiring the whole time because I have that same framework. I'm like, oh my God, the work that's being done here is astonishing, And so that work is the lifeblood of the economy. That's when we started all the way up. You said oil is the master resource, and it really is. And I would invite people to just look at all this, everything that shows up in my life. If I look at it the one way, it's there because of oil, right? Even if it's ceramic that somebody hand threw and fired up with charcoal in a kiln, like how that clay got to them and how the cup got to me, everything's got oil in it somehow, some way. So let's get back to what I think is the most important question, which is oil and plus liquids. It's complicated. Let's just take it as oil for the moment. Hit 100 million barrels a day of production and consumption right before this crisis hit, right around. And then it collapsed back to 80. Do you think, does the world get back to 100 million barrels a day of production and consumption?
Probably not.
And why is that? Is it a production issue or is it a consumption issue?
Well, it's both. The two are end members of the same wave equation, basically. And so we started off talking about how this is a generational, or larger experience that we're all part of right now. And we keep talking about, well, when we emerge, as if it ever ends. It's changed everything. And so we're not going back to where we were, whatever the outcome is, no matter what. And in oil, my belief is that if this thing has a happy ending somehow, which is to say we come out of it feeling better differently. In other words, we have an economy that that supports people at least as well, if not better, than before. I don't think we're going to be using as much oil in that economy because we're all making changes. I've done more business on this platform we're talking on right now than in the 2 years or so that I've had a license for it previous. Mm-hmm. And a lot of those meetings that I used to have in person, they go a lot better this way. People behave differently. Yeah. They're kind of more to the point. They don't screw around and digress as much. And it's and it's relatively, so it's a cheaper way of doing things. We don't drive around to go to the meeting. All the companies that are leasing space in downtown Houston at $40 a square foot are saying, well, geez, do we really need to be paying that much money? We've been surviving with people not even coming into work. So that's, I think that's the simple story, that we're just, as we adapt, we are learning what we can do without. And for me, if there's a happy ending to this, it is precisely that.
Mhm.
Can we live as well or nearly as well with less? Because to me, that's the whole, whether we're in the 1970s or 80s or 90s. I mean, I've always said, well, yeah, we could do all this fancy technology and we could do, you know, solar, wind, etc. But why don't we just use less? Why don't we all stop driving ourselves to work alone in our cars? Can't we just take a bus or something? It just seems simple and logical to me, not because I'm in the oil business. It just seems like a smarter way to do things. Well, this kind of experience, I think, is teaching us that. Do we really need to have a choice between 17 different kinds of milk at the grocery store? Really?
Mhm.
I mean, would 3 or 4 be just as good? Would my life be worse if I only had 4 kinds of milk as opposed to 17 or 18? Probably not. It'd probably be okay.
Yeah, I'm totally with you there. And I made this point a long time ago when I ejected from the corporate world, and I cut my standard of living in half, but I doubled my quality of life.
Mm,
And so I think this is one of the positives that's going to come out of COVID, is this idea of separating quantity from quality, right? And so people are discovering who's important, what's important. And it turns out that a lot of our economy, though, is based on quantity. It was just more, more stuff, more junk, more things that didn't really mean anything to people. So I actually could see permanent damage to that story. The problem is, and maybe even it's a predicament, is we built up an entire financial infrastructure and a set of financialization skimming operations that are based on more all the time. That's what the Fed's defending and trying to get back. Well, if we could just get people back doing what they used to do, but I think that world's over. It's gone. It's in the rear view mirror. It is for me. I know there's going to be millions of people like me who are going to be there. You're going to have to do a lot of convincing to get me back on a cruise ship. I'm probably not going to be taking a lot of, trips like I used to. I'm perfectly comfortable conducting business like this. So business trips way down. But even with the idea of, uh, uh, I can feel my habits changing already around, not like, I just don't like to be around large crowds of people who aren't wearing face masks right now because of where we are in the story. So that's me, right? To the extent that there's even 15-20% of the population has come to that same conclusion, things are just different than they used to be. Doesn't mean it's over, but boy, is it changed, And so on that basis, just looking at, I agree with you. I don't think we're going back to 100 million barrels a day of production or consumption for a whole lot of reasons, but that means the economy isn't what it used to be, and that isn't coming back. And I'm actually looking forward to what is coming as part of that, because I think we get to have that quantity versus quality discussion, which is actually more interesting to me. Yeah.
agree.
So looking at that, I want to get back to an earlier point you made, because I'm sure a couple people picked up on it. I'm going to be putting in micro hydro here, solar. If I had wind, we're in a valley, I would put wind in because I think they're all good. But here's something that we haven't had. Here's what I'd love to see, Art, is that demonstration city. Pick a city like small, 100,000 people. All they have is wind or solar. That's it. 100%. That's all you get. And we'll give you all the resources you want. Like, fund this thing. Throw billions of federal dollars at it. But you have to rebuild those components on site from the energy that comes out of those machines and devices. And you have to fund your society at the same time. I'd love to see that experiment run, because I think we'd learn some things. And one of the things we would learn is that's really a lower quality life than we were expecting.
And
Would you
there's a
agree?
lot of things that we're not going to be able to do, which may be good based on what we've been talking about here. But yeah, the it's important. You made a comment earlier that just about everything we do and have has oil written on it somewhere. And so if we're talking about a solar panel or a wind turbine, well, where does all that stuff come from? Well, the primary components are mined out of the earth, and mining is done with the same technology as your bush hog. Okay,
Mhm.
it's done with diesel. All right.
Yep.
And once you got it out of the ground and processed, which also works with internal combustion for the most part, then you got to send it somewhere to be manufactured. And that happens on ships, which run on basically diesel. And then you put it in a factory and you turn it into, the components of a solar collector or a wind turbine. And most of that runs on electricity, which could eventually be wind or solar. But for now, in most of the world, it's coal and might be a mix of coal and natural gas. And then you got to put it back on a ship, which is diesel, send it to somewhere like the United States where it gets picked up in a truck, which runs on diesel, which takes it finally to wherever it's going to be installed. Most wind turbines, if you have never witnessed the installation of a wind turbine, for those that think that a frac crew on a well is kind of an astonishing industrial grade operation, go out and look at a wind turbine being set up sometime. A lot of people, a lot of diesel powered equipment going on out there. So again, I'm in no way criticizing wind and solar. I'm just saying that you can't do them. You can't do them without oil. And somebody in this audience is going to say, yeah, Art, but that's now. I mean, won't we be able to develop some technology that will be able to make all that happen differently? And my answer to that is maybe, but I'm not holding my breath. Technology doesn't create energy. Technology is it's the faucet. It's how do I get the energy converted into work? And so if the technology is better, what that means is that I can convert it faster. It doesn't mean that, certainly I don't create anything more, and it doesn't mean it lasts any longer. Usually faster means it runs out more quickly. So to me, technology, I'm a great technology fan. We're both of us work with technology daily, so I'm not criticizing it at all, but to place our hope in something that doesn't exist and that really doesn't solve the problem when it comes to energy, I think is a mistake.
Yeah. Yeah. So as we wind up here, I'm just I know that I read something recently. You're tracking. Here was a big issue that was coming up that the United States was maybe going to run out of storage room. Right, Cushing was going to fill up, and we're going to fill every available tanker, and they're all going to be parked offshore, anchored, and we're going to run out of space. Where are we on that story? Because my real question is, I think there's going to be a time to invest back into the oil space for people who are interested in investing in that space. I don't think the time is yet. I'm just wondering where you stand in that whole story of where we are, supply to demand versus storage.
Well, we've avoided the storage crisis as I felt we would. There's nothing like no place to put it, and actually negative oil prices for one day, which is sort of more complicated than that. But the bottom line is if there's no place to put it and you still produce it, then you either have to pay somebody who does have space to take it, or you have to put it on the ground, which is not only stupid, but illegal. So the result is that people shut in production at a breathtaking rate. Now that the immediate crisis is past, all those companies are now looking at opening up all that production again. Why? Because they got a lot of debt and they need cash flow to service the debt so they don't go bankrupt, so that the United States government doesn't have to be the owner of oil companies. The immediate crisis is over, but the problem hasn't been resolved. So that's, and the same thing is going on around the world. I mean, we've got an OPEC meeting going on right now. They seem to happen like every 3 weeks or something these days. But when you're trying to manage a market, which doesn't lend itself to management, and you've done it for 4 years, well, you're going to have to make a lot of corrections that also aren't going to work. But I mean, you got a country like Iraq. The big dispute at the OPEC meeting right now is, what are we going to do about those bad boys in places like Iraq and Nigeria in Algeria that cheat on the agreements that we make to curtail production. Well, here's the deal. A country like Iraq, 80% of the government's money comes from oil. And at current oil prices, they can't pay half the salaries to their government workers. So they need to pay the salaries. So what you call cheating is what they call surviving.
Mm.
We got to get cash flow somehow, or else we can't run a government. We got to pay our employees. So countries around the world are not that different from companies in the United States or the situations that we're describing. And so the world is oversupplied with oil and has been consistently for about 5 years because of all the things we've been talking about, and that is not going away. It will, the tendency is to produce more whenever possible. And you produce more, you end up with too much, price goes down, you get a crisis, repeat. That's the pattern we're into.
So in terms of, we're probably, your predictions, we're going to be oversupplied for a while. Whether we run out of storage or not seems like we know how to manage that part of the crisis. People will shut in production if they have to. But beyond that, we're probably going to be oversupplied for a while at current rates because oil demand was down something whopping like 20% at one point. But even if it's down 10%, it stabilizes down there, we're still oversupplied at that level, right?
Consumption is down 20 or 25% still.
Still? Wow.
Yeah, 20% less. These numbers are hard to know. We don't know for the world. The United States, we have an estimate every week. The estimates are unreliable, but they're close maybe. They're subject to revision. So we're guessing. But and by the way, when people say, "Oh well, it's coming right back," well, they're guessing too. Everyone's guessing. No, we're in a level of uncertainty right now where the past doesn't really help us very much at all.
Yeah. Yeah. Hey, quick question. I haven't found any good answer to this. Some people say yes, some people say no. When a shale well is shut in, is any damage done? Can that be done? You're smiling.
Well, there's a million opinions. You ask an engineer and they'll say, no problem. It just comes right back. We shut them in when we do a frack on a nearby well, et cetera, et cetera. Every geologist in the room rolls his eyes and say, whoa, man, I mean, you do that and, you change the pressure and you got clays moving around in the rock and oh my God. My simple answer to that is pretty unlikely. Like the economy, you turn it off and then you turn it on and it doesn't quite come back the way that it was when you turned it off. Mm-hmm. And so the next question is, how much time and money is it going to cost to try to get it back close to where it was before? Now, some of those wells, they're going to come right back on just great. Most of them are going to require some level of money and time, and they probably won't quite get back to where they are or where they were. That's my sense. Again, opinions are all over the place because we've never done this before. We've shut in a well here and there because of mechanical reasons or whatever, but we haven't shut in tens of thousands of wells. So the answer, again, the level of uncertainty is huge. We won't know until we do it. My sense is the results will be less optimistic than the engineers say.
Yep. All right. Well, final question. Do you have a garden?
I do.
How's it growing this year?
It's growing great. Down here in Texas, it's hot. And so we're getting to the point where the, things like the tomatoes and the lettuce are pretty much toward the end of their first harvest. So I'll be getting out my rototiller before long, fire it up with some petroleum and till under the parts of the garden that need to be replanted. But yeah, things are going. We've had a great spring. It's been wet. It's been reasonably mild. So the garden's going great.
We went from from probably, I think, the coldest April on record to the driest May.
Hmm.
So cold and then dry. And my farming friends say, too wet will scare you, too dry will starve you. So I'm glad you had your water, because water's a good thing. It's right up there with
We're
oil.
about to get a lot more with this tropical storm
Oh,
that's
that's right.
Cristobal is probably going to drop a bunch of rain at the very least on the Houston area. I guess we don't know where it's going to go, but that's part of the excitement of living in the Gulf Coast, hurricane season, 6 months of the year.
Well, this is an early start potentially with that one. So,
Well, we had one of the warmest winters in the United States we've ever had. Fifth warmest, I think it's the fifth warmest winter in terms of how we measure that heating degree days. And it's the warmest in about 4 years. So it's warm.
we meaning down in Texas,
United
in the
States,
global,
United
United
States.
States. Yeah. So actually, I remember after 9/11, there were no planes flying for like a week, and all
Right.
these climate people were saying, "Oh my gosh, look at all the heat coming down because the skies are clear," and so there was a lot less albedo, a lot less reflective stuff. So more heat came down and came deeper down
Mm.
rather than being caught up there in the atmosphere reflected. So I'm wondering about this with like the largest, longest shutdown. My theory is that if the 9/11 data was true, we're going to see a lot more warming than we expect based on that. But I haven't got any data on that yet. It's just a theory. But if that's true, maybe we'll get more storms too.
Well, I hope not. I don't enjoy hurricane season down here.
Yeah.
As long as I don't have to leave pack up my car and go somewhere, particularly in COVID times. How that's going to work, but we'll see. We'll see.
Right. Right. Well, make sure you have lots of face masks and things just in case. But
We do.
yeah.
We're set.
All right. Well, hey, Art, thank you so much for your time today, and love the Zoom technology. It's working great for us here, and really appreciate you taking the time to share your expertise with us here today.
Always good to talk, Chris. Thanks.
All right. Well, be well, and we'll do this again.
Bye.